All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Module 6. So for Module 6, we're actually going to go back to Confucius, who we talked about in Module 1, by talking about a follower of Confucius. So just as with Plato and Aristotle, in some senses, tracing back to that figure of Socrates, Confucius is the founder of a whole history of moral philosophy all the way up until the current day. And in that history are other important people, just as with Socrates, Plato and Aristotle gained prominence as their own philosophers in their own right. The Confucian philosopher we're going to look at in this module goes by two names in English related to the problem of translating a name from a different language, very different language, into English and into English spelling. So this figure went by the name Mencius for quite some time in English, Mencius. But not too long ago, got that updated by scholars of these things to the name Mengzi, Mengzi, which I try to say slightly in a Chinese way, but I don't speak Chinese, certainly not ancient Chinese. So don't worry too much about these names. But you do need to know that you're going to see both of those names even in this module. It's still a little confusing out there. So Mencius in your reading, I might say Mencius, but I'm going to try to say Mengzi, since Mengzi is the most recent version that scholars say that's the name we should use. So he was born about 100 years after Confucius died, so was not a student of Confucius directly, did not know Confucius, but as you learned in the Confucius unit, it was pretty fast that Confucianism, so a way of thinking that tried to adhere to the teachings of Confucius, had risen up. There were schools and teachers, and so Mengzi becomes a Confucius thinker. And like Confucius, he was a kind of traveling teacher. This was still during the Warring States period, which is a phrase I use to talk about Confucius, a time of a lot of strife in ancient China, a lot of war. And he would travel around, Mengzi would travel around being a teacher, but also offering counsel to rulers. So just like Confucius, trying to be of some use to people who were trying to organize society. Okay, so we look at Mengzi not just with Confucius in the background of our class, but also the background of this general philosophical question of what are humans basically like? Are they basically good or basically bad? And we talked about that a little bit with the Ode to Man, that poem that we pulled out of the play Antigone. And the question about what humans are basically like, of course, is also framed against the background question of this course of just how are we all going to live together? And it seems like a relevant question that if we're going to figure out how to live together, we're going to answer that Greek question, we also need to think about what it is that humans are basically like, on the assumption that I'll ask you to also think about that what we are basically like might impact how we answer the question of how we're supposed to all get along. So there was a lot of physical, maybe some physical debate sometimes, but a lot of philosophical debate on this very question in ancient China as well. What are humans basically like, basically good or basically bad? Now, there's another character in this period, a contemporary of Mengzi, named Xunzi, Xunzi, who I've actually never really read. So this unit is not about him, but we're talking about him by way of contrast. Xunzi had this view that people are basically evil, is the word that gets used in the translations. And so I found a quotation here that will help illustrate this. So this is a quotation from Xunzi. Now, since human nature is evil, it must await the instructions of a teacher and the model before it can be put aright. And it must obtain ritual principles and a sense of moral right before it can become orderly. End of quotation. So it's pretty clear and direct, which is why I'm using it. It says flat out that he thinks people are evil. But Xunzi was a moral philosopher, and he thought we just need to acknowledge that, and based on acknowledging that, we can approach society and approach education in a way that tries to put it aright, as he says, tries to fix the problem. Mengzi had a different view. He built out a moral philosophy from his conviction that human nature is fundamentally good, often translated as humaneness. So human animals naturally have a kind of humanity built into them from the start, and this was Mengzi's view. So the very short readings that I've given you, just 2.5 pages really, are to that effect. They want to try to establish that position. They're a little bit hard to read. They're very, very different from Aristotle and Plato that I've had you look at, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But in the reading, he tries to establish this other position. And in both cases, both Xunzi and Mengzi, whether you see humans as basically good or basically evil at the start, there's a need for moral education. So they agree on that. And so we might ask, does it really matter? And we are going to ask that. I'm going to ask you to think about whether it really matters how we think about what a human is like, morally speaking, naturally. Okay, so then I want you to also notice, though, as you read this short selection from Mengzi, to think about how he's trying to communicate it, and to think about the contrast with Plato and Aristotle. How does the argument get made in Mengzi? We saw in Plato and Aristotle that there's a kind of argument from reason, you might say. We saw Socrates having discussions with people where he used logical principles to try to make progress towards moral philosophy. And then in Aristotle as well, he tried to think logically, almost geometrically, scientifically, about what the right kind of life should be. The Mengzi seems very different from that. So you might think about what language you would give that. How is Mengzi trying to convince us if he's not going to use this kind of Greek approach of arguing about these things rationally and from reason? Okay, I think that's it. So look in the questions on this module to help you work with the Mengzi material.